not so much on the comprehensive overview of the events, but in reading the book, some of the, I would say the more anecdotal moments, or some of the more, I would say, complex political moments that you both address and maybe in one or two cases don't fully address, because it's impossible to address all of them. So we'll talk for a little while, then we'll turn it over to you. Keeping in mind that this is the Ukrainian Institute, you have a very interesting discussion about a kind of an episode or a moment in the discussion about expanding Ukraine, and about a personality who plays a very important role in Soviet foreign policy, Alexander Kornichuk, who is married to a woman who, if you know the Soviet period, a lot of streets were named after her. One of us in that script. So I only knew her as a, as a woman of the streets. But now I know exactly what her main historical role is. And she was the wife of Alexander Kornichuk. Now, you make the point that a very nationalistic, from the Ukrainian point of view, article appears in February 1943, 2 years before Yalta, in Pravda, Ukraine, by this fellow Kornichuk, called The Reunification of the Ukrainian People in Their Own State. And this, I don't want to say, this is a broad sweep of Ukrainian history, Khmelnytsky and the struggles and so on and so forth. And it's kind of, almost a kind of an argument that someone from the Bandera movement would make for, sustaining an ethnographically Ukrainian state. We also know that at the same time as the war was going on, there was this whole dimension of, Stalin using Russian nationalism and the Orthodox Church and returning to traditional pillars and values. Can you talk a little bit about this episode of nationalism and the prefiguring of the strategic desire, even in 43, where by no means the fate of the war is clear? There is this clear strategic vision of reincorporating what would be considered ethnographic lands. Can you tell us about Mr. Kornichuk, that whole discussion, and anything about the broader context, how his Soviet and Russian colleagues looked upon this issue and how they developed that idea?
Well, thanks for this question. It really goes to the core of many things that interested me the most in that period. One of the conclusions to which I came researching this book was that the Soviet power and the Bolsheviks, they won the war, and before that the revolution, not only because they were more ruthless than their competitors or enemies, but also because they were more flexible. And in 1919, they were prepared to use the Ukrainian national motives, ideas, and culture to win over Ukraine. And the same is happening in 1943, 1944, when the Soviet army is returning back to the territories that were taken by the Germans. It finds there a very different kind of population, a population that for 2 years was outside of their control, the population that is more nationally conscious than it was in 1941. The war is not over, the war is not won yet. They are facing the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian insurgent army, and they're trying to present themselves as the true representatives and defenders of the Ukrainian national interests. Stalin also tries to use Ukrainian cards to score a couple of points abroad, and in particular he uses Ukrainian cadres like Kornichuk to wage the war with the Polish government, and particularly Polish government in exile. So he positions himself already in 1943 with Kornichuk writing this article about the future borders of Ukraine, saying that, well, I'm actually a neutral party here. There are Ukrainians and they have their interests and they state and they can't ignore that. And they want to live and they want home or and they won Peremyśl. And, well, the representatives of the Polish government, they should be reasonable. This is not the time pushing this agenda. This is the paper I got from Mr. Khrushchev, who demands home as ancient traditional Ukrainian city.
And of course his wife was.
And Khrushchev's wife, Nina Kovarchuk, was from home. So at Yalta, Stalin, arguing with FDR and Churchill regarding the future border between the Soviet Union and Poland, he says, well, you can't expect me to be more Russian as was Lord Curzon, who drew this line. How can I go back to Moscow? What would the Ukrainians say? And one of the chapters in my book is called, in the quotation marks, what would the Ukrainians say? So basically, he is trying to play Ukrainian card and position himself in the way that would actually bring most benefits for him and for the Soviet Union in these negotiations. Another, of course, thing about the Yalta conference, which I didn't mention at the beginning about the importance of the conference for Ukraine, because it was at Yalta where it was decided that Ukraine would become the member of the Assembly, UN Assembly. And Kyiv actually started its international career in that way much sooner than Ukraine became independent, so it began in 1945. So Stalin needed additional votes in the United Nations, and he presented Ukraine as his showcase why republics, Soviet republics, and in particular Ukraine and Belarus, should have this representation in the United Nations. They contributed the most to, they suffered the most from the German aggression. They contributed the most to the victory over Germany, not like Argentina or Turkey or something like that. That's kind of comparisons that Stalin makes. And also, he at the end creates such things in 1944 as a result of the constitutional reform as the Special People's Commissariat in Ukraine for relations with the West. France, the Red Army France, or army groups, are called Ukrainian 1st, 2nd, 3rd, Belarusian 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and basically all of that in preparation for this negotiations at Yalta and negotiations regarding the United Nations organization. So, returning to Kornichuk, he, like Wanda Wasilewska, who was of course of Polish descent, came from a very prominent Polish family. His father, Lev Wasilewski, was one of the political activists in Poland. They were used as tools in this game that Joseph Stalin was playing on the international level.
You spoke about the bugging of the dachas or the residences of the Allied delegations, and there was a sort of daily reporting of what was being said in preparation to Stalin. You also, in your remarks, alluded that it really didn't matter all that much because, in a sense, what they were proposing was not so much at odds. The differences between Stalin and FDR were such that probably they would have. It showed that there was not some kind of radical conspiracy, so that information wasn't as important. And yet, there was also the phenomenon of the massive infiltration of the intelligence systems of both of these countries. So Alger Hiss, a spy, was part of the U.S. delegation. McLean Burgess and the company were already operating. The Cambridge Group was operating, and so on and so forth. I mean, you seem to suggest that at Yalta it wasn't significant, but to what extent in the period leading up to Yalta or in the period immediately after would you ascribe a substantial, say, tactical or even strategic advantage to the Russians that they had this kind of